My husband's family accused me of faking my miscarriage for sympathy, but the hospital footage proved who was really lying. It started when Dylan's mother told me I was showing too much for 8 weeks. She said real pregnant women barely show at all early on. I didn't think much of it then. By week 12, I was bleeding heavily. I called Dylan from the bathroom floor, terrified and in pain. He was at his parents' house for Sunday dinner. He asked if I could just take some Tylenol. His mom said spotting was normal. I drove myself to the ER while contractions tore through my body. The doctor confirmed what I already knew. I'd lost the baby. Dylan showed up the next morning with his mother, not to comfort me, but to interrogate me. His mother mentioned I was dehydrated, then asked if I'd even been taking care of myself. Dylan stood silently while she accused me of not eating enough, exercising too much, being too stressed, as if I'd killed our baby through negligence. At home, it got worse. His sister posted on the family group chat that some women fake miscarriages for attention. Dylan's aunt replied with an article about factitious disorder. Nobody mentioned my name, but the message was clear. 2 weeks later, at a family gathering, Dylan's mother made her announcement. She said they'd all been talking and thought I'd made up the miscarriage because I got cold feet about being a mother. Dylan's father nodded slowly. His sister wouldn't meet my eyes. I mentioned I had hospital records. His mother replied smoothly that records can be faked, that I work in medical billing so I'd know how. I looked at Dylan, waiting for him to defend me. He mumbled that I'd been pretty distant lately, that I never really seemed excited about the baby. That night, I requested my complete medical records, including something I hadn't known existed. The hospital had security footage. 3 days later, I had a USB drive with 4 hours of footage. I called a family meeting. Dylan's entire family showed up, probably expecting another interrogation. Instead, I connected my laptop to their TV. The first clip showed me collapsing in the ER entrance, a nurse catching me before I hit the floor. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m., exactly when I'd called Dylan begging him to meet me. The second clip showed the ultrasound room. You couldn't hear audio, but you could see the exact moment I understood my baby was gone. My face crumpled. The third clip showed me alone in the hospital room at 2 a.m., curled around my empty stomach, sobbing into a pillow. Dylan's mother stood abruptly, calling this manipulative. I clicked to the final clip. It showed Dylan arriving the next morning, timestamp 10:15 a.m. His mother was with him. The footage showed them talking to my nurse. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. The nurse gestured toward my room. Dylan's mother shook her head firmly and pointed at her watch. Dylan nodded. They turned and walked toward the elevator. The timestamp showed they left the hospital at 10:26 a.m. Dylan had told me he'd been there all morning. His mother had never come upstairs at all. They'd gotten coffee in the cafeteria and left. I told him he'd abandoned me. While I was hemorrhaging, he left because his mother said they should get breakfast first. The room erupted. His sister yelled that I'd clearly edited the footage. Dylan sat frozen, staring at the screen where his own betrayal played on loop. His mother's face told me everything. She'd known all along the miscarriage was real. She'd seen me in that hospital bed and decided I wasn't worthy of compassion. I announced I wanted a divorce. That when they accused me of faking the worst thing that ever happened to me, they were really covering up what they did. I grabbed my laptop and walked out. But as I reached my car, I noticed something on the USB drive I hadn't watched yet. A folder labeled visitor log, full week. My hands shook as I clicked it open. Because if Dylan and his mother had lied about that morning, what else had they lied about? The visitor log showed every person who'd entered the maternity ward during my stay. I scrolled through the timestamps, my heart pounding. Dylan had checked in at 10:15 a.m. and checked out at 10:26 a.m., exactly as the footage showed. But there was another entry. Dylan's mother had checked in the night before, at 11:43 p.m. She'd been there. While I was alone and terrified, she'd been somewhere in that hospital. The log showed she'd checked out at 11:52 p.m., 9 minutes. She'd stayed 9 minutes, then left without ever coming to my room. I scrolled further and found something worse. Dylan had checked in that first night too, at 10:03 p.m., 16 minutes after I'd called him begging for help. He'd checked out at 10:11 p.m., 8 minutes. He'd been there. He'd come to the hospital while I was in the ER, stayed 8 minutes, and left. Then he'd lied about it the next morning, pretending he'd just arrived. I sat in my car, staring at the screen until my vision blurred. Every interaction, every accusation, every moment of their cruelty suddenly made sense. They'd known from the beginning. They'd seen me at my most vulnerable and chosen to abandon me. Then they'd spent weeks gaslighting me, making me question my own trauma, all to cover up their guilt. I drove to my best friend Renee's apartment. She'd been trying to reach me for days, but I'd been too buried in grief and rage to respond. When she opened the door and saw my face, she just pulled me inside. I showed her everything. The footage, the visitor logs, the group chat messages. She watched in silence, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. You know they're going to deny all of this. They'll say the logs are wrong, that the footage is misleading. They'll make you the villain, no matter what you show them. I knew she was right. I'd already seen how Dylan's family operated. Facts didn't matter when reputation was at stake, but I wasn't planning to convince them anymore. I was planning to protect myself. The next morning, I contacted a divorce attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she'd handled her share of ugly separations. When I explained the situation and showed her the evidence, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. This is one of the most calculated cases of emotional abuse I've seen, she said. And the best part is, You have everything documented. In our state, cruelty and abandonment were grounds for fault-based divorce. The evidence I had wasn't just damning, it was ironclad. Patricia filed the papers that afternoon. Dylan was served at his office the next day. He called me 17 times in 2 hours. I didn't answer. Finally, he showed up at the apartment we'd shared, pounding on the door. His mother was with him. Of course she was. I opened the door with my phone already recording. Dylan started talking immediately, words tumbling over each other. He was sorry, he'd made a mistake. We could work through this. His mother stood behind him, her face tight with fury. She knew exactly why I was divorcing him, and she knew I had proof, but she wasn't about to let her son's reputation be destroyed without a fight. You're being dramatic, she said, pushing past Dylan. Marriages go through hard times. You don't throw away a relationship over one disagreement. I looked at her calmly and said it wasn't one disagreement. It was systematic abandonment followed by a coordinated campaign to make me believe I was crazy. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. I have the visitor logs, I said. I know you were at the hospital that night. I know you stayed 9 minutes and left. I know Dylan came and left after 8 minutes. And I know both of you lied about it. The color drained from her face. Dylan looked between us, confused. What's she talking about? He asked his mother, but she'd already turned and walked toward the elevator. Dylan followed, calling after her, demanding answers. I closed the door and locked it. That night, Dylan's sister called me, not to apologize, but to warn me. Mom's hiring a lawyer, she said. She's going to fight this. She's going to make sure you don't get anything. Let her try, I said, and hung up. The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks later. Dylan's family showed up in force, their attorney armed with character witnesses and testimonials about what a devoted husband he'd been. Patricia countered with the hospital footage, the visitor logs, and screenshots of every message from the family group chat. She presented a timeline of their behavior, from Dylan's 8-minute hospital visit to his mother's interrogation while I was still bleeding. The mediator watched everything in silence. When Patricia finished, Dylan's attorney tried to argue that the footage was taken out of context, that Dylan had been in shock, that his mother had been trying to help in her own way. Patricia pulled out one more piece of evidence I'd found buried in my email. The day after my miscarriage, Dylan had sent a message to his brother. Mom thinks she's faking, he'd written, but even if she's not, she's being dramatic about it. I showed it to the mediator. Dylan's face went pale. The mediator ruled in my favor on almost every point. I got the apartment, the car, and half of our savings. More importantly, the mediator noted in the official record that Dylan had abandoned me during a medical emergency and then participated in a pattern of emotional abuse. It was in writing now, part of the legal record. Dylan signed the papers without arguing. His mother wasn't at the final hearing. According to Dylan's sister, she'd locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out. She'd been so certain she could control the narrative, manipulate the system the same way she'd manipulated her son. But the truth had a way of being stubborn. After the divorce was finalized, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt hollow. I'd lost a baby, a marriage, and any illusion that the family I'd married into had ever cared about me. I'd won legally, but emotionally, I was destroyed. I took a leave of absence from work and spent a month at my sister's house across the state. She had 2 kids under 5, and her life was chaos, which was exactly what I needed. I couldn't think about my own pain when I was breaking up toddler fights and building blanket forts. One afternoon, while the kids napped, my sister and I sat on her back porch drinking coffee. She'd been careful not to push, letting me process everything at my own pace. But finally, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. Are you okay? I thought about it for a long time before answering. No, I said, but I will be. And I meant it. I was broken, but I wasn't defeated. Dylan's family had tried to erase my trauma, to make me doubt my own experience. They'd failed. The truth was documented, recorded, undeniable. That had to count for something. When I returned home 6 weeks later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from Dylan's mother, handwritten on expensive stationery. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages long. She wrote about how she'd been protecting her son, how she'd thought I was overreacting, how she'd made mistakes in judgment, but nowhere in those 3 pages did she actually apologize. Nowhere did she acknowledge what she'd done. Instead, she explained it, justified it, made it about her intentions rather than my pain. The last paragraph was the most revealing. She wrote that she hoped someday I'd understand that mothers have to protect their children, even when it means making hard choices. That family loyalty sometimes requires sacrifice, that she'd only been doing what any mother would do. I read it twice, then tore it into pieces. She still didn't get it. She still thought she'd been right to abandon me in that hospital, right to accuse me of faking my grief, right to coordinate a campaign to make me question my own reality, because in her mind, protecting Dylan's comfort was more important than my suffering. I threw the letter away and never responded. Some people can't be reached by evidence or reason. They've built their entire identity on a narrative, and admitting they were wrong would mean dismantling who they think they are. Dylan's mother would go to her grave believing she'd done the right thing, but I didn't need her acknowledgement anymore. I had the truth, and that was enough. 3 months after the divorce, I ran into one of Dylan's cousins at the grocery store. We'd always gotten along, and she'd been noticeably absent from the family's attacks. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, but walked over anyway. I heard what happened, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I wanted to reach out, but Mom said the family was staying united. I nodded, not surprised. The cousin hesitated, then added something that made my stomach drop. You should know, Dylan's engaged again. Already. I must have looked shocked because she quickly continued. Her name is Bethany. She's 23. They met at his gym 2 months ago. His mother loves her. Says she's exactly what Dylan needs. Someone uncomplicated. I thanked her for telling me and left before she could see my hands shaking. 2 months. He'd been dating someone new just 2 months after our divorce finalized, which meant he'd started seeing her while we were still legally married, while I was still processing the worst trauma of my life. That night, I did something I'd been avoiding. I looked at Dylan's social media. His mother had unblocked me, probably not realizing I could see everything now. There were photos from a family dinner, Dylan's arm around a young blonde woman with a bright smile. Bethany, presumably. The caption read, "Welcome to the family," with a heart emoji. Dylan's mother had commented, "Finally, someone who makes my boy happy." I stared at that comment for a long time. Finally. As if I'd been the problem. As if their cruelty had been my fault. As if my grief had been an inconvenience they'd heroically endured. I closed the app and blocked everyone in Dylan's family. Every single one of them. I didn't need to see their carefully curated happiness, their revision of history. They could tell whatever story they wanted now. I had my own truth. Over the next year, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I got a promotion at work. I moved to a better apartment. I started therapy to process not just the miscarriage, but the gaslighting that had followed. My therapist helped me understand that what Dylan's family had done wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. They'd seen my vulnerability and exploited it to protect their own comfort. The miscarriage itself was a tragedy. What they did afterward was a choice. I started dating again cautiously. Most first dates ended with me explaining that I was divorced and had trust issues. Some men were understanding. Others weren't. I met Terrence at a hospital charity event. He was a pediatric surgeon, recently widowed and completely unpretentious. We talked for hours about loss, healing, and starting over. He didn't try to fix me or minimize my experience. He just listened. 6 months into dating, I told him the whole story. Everything, from the miscarriage to the footage to the divorce. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made me cry. You survived people who were supposed to love you. That takes more strength than most people will ever need. We got engaged a year later. His daughter from his first marriage was the flower girl. My sister was my maid of honor. I didn't invite anyone from Dylan's family, obviously, but I also didn't invite several people from my own family who told me during the divorce that I should have tried harder to make it work, that Dylan's mother had just been worried about her son, that I was being vindictive by using the footage against them. Those family members hadn't been there in that hospital room. They hadn't felt the contractions or seen the blood or experienced the crushing grief of losing a baby. They definitely hadn't been gaslit for weeks by people who knew the truth, so they didn't get to have opinions about my choices. The wedding was small, just 40 people who'd actually supported me through the worst period of my life. It was perfect. During the reception, Renee pulled me aside. "Remember when you showed me that footage?" she asked. "I told you they'd never admit they were wrong." I nodded. She smiled. "I'm glad you didn't need them to. Terrence and I bought a house in a different part of the city, somewhere with no memories of Dylan, no chance of running into his family at the grocery store. We talked about having kids, but decided to wait. I needed more time to heal, and he understood. His daughter was enough family for now. 2 years after my wedding, I got a message on social media from someone I didn't recognize. The profile was private, but the message made my hands go cold. "You ruined my relationship. Dylan and I were happy until you poisoned everyone against him with your lies." Bethany. She'd found me. I didn't respond, but I didn't block her either. I was curious what else she'd say. Over the next week, she sent 17 more messages, each one more unhinged than the last. She accused me of spreading rumors about Dylan's family, of faking evidence, of being obsessed with her new husband. Apparently, Dylan had told her a very different version of our marriage. In his story, I'd been unstable and attention-seeking. The miscarriage had been real, but I'd used it to manipulate him. His family had tried to help, but I'd turned on them. The footage and visitor logs apparently didn't exist in his version. Or if they did, they'd been taken out of context. I finally responded with one message. Ask Dylan about the visitor logs. Ask him how long he stayed at the hospital the night I lost our baby. Ask his mother why she was there for 9 minutes and never came to my room. Then I blocked her. I don't know if she ever asked him those questions. I don't know if he told her the truth or spun another lie. It wasn't my problem anymore. But 3 months later, I got a call from Dylan's cousin, the one who'd told me about Bethany in the first place. She sounded upset. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," she started. "But Bethany's pregnant, 5 months along, and Dylan's mother is already criticizing everything she does." I thanked her for the call but didn't say what I was thinking. That poor woman. She had no idea what she'd married into. The criticism would get worse. The control would tighten, and if anything went wrong with the pregnancy, they'd find a way to make it her fault. Part of me wanted to warn her, to send her the footage, the logs, everything, but she'd already decided I was a liar. She wouldn't believe me even if I had video of Dylan admitting the truth. So I let it go. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. 6 months later, Dylan's cousin called again. Bethany had the baby, a little girl. Dylan's mother had been in the delivery room, directing the nurses, criticizing Bethany's breathing techniques. Afterward, she'd apparently told Bethany that her recovery was taking too long, that she needed to be more grateful, that she wasn't bonding with the baby correctly. The cousin said Bethany had started seeing a therapist, that she'd mentioned feeling controlled and undermined, that Dylan never defended her when his mother criticized her parenting. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because it proved I hadn't been the problem, sadness because another woman was now suffering the same treatment. I asked the cousin if Bethany knew about me, about what really happened. She said Dylan's family never talked about me. I'd been erased from the narrative completely, as if I'd never existed, as if our marriage had been a brief aberration that didn't count. Terrence and I decided to try for a baby. I was terrified, but my therapist had helped me work through most of my fears. We got pregnant 3 months later. This time, everything was different. Terrence came to every appointment, held my hand during every ultrasound, researched every symptom I mentioned. His daughter was excited to be a big sister. She made drawings for the baby's nursery and practiced holding her baby dolls the right way. At 12 weeks, the same point where I'd lost my first baby, I had a panic attack in the ultrasound room. Terrence held me while I sobbed, convinced I was about to see an empty screen again. But the technician smiled and turned the monitor toward us. There was the heartbeat, strong and steady. "I'm here for all of it," Terrence whispered. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." Our son was born healthy at 38 weeks. The delivery was long and difficult, but I was surrounded by people who loved me. Terrence never left my side. My sister was in the waiting room with his daughter. Renee showed up with flowers and champagne. Nobody questioned my parenting. Nobody criticized my recovery. Nobody made me feel inadequate or broken. This was what family was supposed to be. 4 years after my divorce, I saw Dylan one last time. I was at the park with my son, pushing him on the swings. Dylan was there with his daughter, who looked about 3. We made eye contact across the playground. He looked older, tired. His daughter was crying about something, and he seemed overwhelmed. He walked over, leaving his daughter on a bench. "I haven't forgotten what you did," he said. "How you tried to destroy my family." I looked at him, this man I'd once loved, and felt nothing but pity. "I didn't destroy your family," I said calmly. "I just refused to let you destroy me." He opened his mouth to argue, but his daughter started screaming. He rushed back to her, and I watched him try to soothe her the way his mother had probably taught him, awkwardly, ineffectively. I pushed my son higher on the swing, listening to his delighted squeals. He looked back at me with pure joy, completely trusting. This was what I'd fought for. Not revenge against Dylan's family, but freedom to build something better. As we left the park, I glanced back once. Dylan was still struggling with his daughter, his phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his mother for advice, probably being told he was doing everything wrong. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt relieved that I'd gotten out, that I'd trusted my own experience even when everyone told me I was wrong, that I'd demanded better and found it. The story could have ended there, with me walking away from that playground and never thinking about Dylan or his family again. But life isn't that neat. 5 years after my divorce, my phone rang at 2 a.m. It was Dylan's cousin again, the one who'd kept me updated over the years. She was crying. "I didn't want to call, but I thought you should know. Dylan's mother died. Heart attack. She was 63. I sat up in bed, Terrence stirring beside me. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. The cousin kept talking. "The funeral's on Saturday. The family's asking if you'll come." I almost laughed. They'd spent years erasing me from their narrative, and now they wanted me at her funeral. "Why would they want me there?" I asked. The cousin hesitated. "Because she wrote something. In her papers. A letter addressed to you." My stomach dropped. After all these years, she'd written to me. The cousin said the letter was sealed, that nobody knew what was in it. The family was divided on whether to even tell me about it. Half of them thought I didn't deserve to know. The other half, including the cousin, thought I had a right to decide for myself. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't go to the funeral, but I did arrange to pick up the letter the following week. Dylan's father met me at a coffee shop, looking older and frailer than I remembered. He handed me an envelope without comment, then left before I could say anything. I sat in my car and opened it. The letter was dated 6 months before she died. It was 3 pages long, handwritten in shaky script. It started the same way her previous letter had, with explanations and justifications. But halfway through, something changed. The tone shifted. She wrote about lying awake at night, thinking about that hospital footage, about seeing my face on that screen and finally understanding what she'd done. She wrote about watching Bethany struggle with Dylan's indifference and recognizing the pattern she'd created. She'd raised a son who didn't know how to support his wife because she'd never required him to. She'd taught him that women's pain was something to be managed or dismissed, not honored. The last paragraph broke me. She wrote that she'd been wrong, that she'd known I was telling the truth from the beginning, but had been too proud to admit it, that she'd built her entire identity on protecting her son, even when it meant sacrificing innocent people. She wrote that she was sorry, that she knew sorry wasn't enough, but it was all she had left to give. She ended with a single line, "You deserved better, from all of us." I sat in that parking lot for an hour, reading and rereading those pages. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to reject her apology the same way she'd rejected my pain. But another part of me felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe understanding. She'd been trapped in her own narrative just like I'd been trapped in their gaslighting. The difference was, she'd built her own cage. I never responded to the letter. There was nobody to respond to anymore, but I kept it. Someday, when my son is older and asks about my first marriage, I'll show him the hospital footage and the visitor logs. I'll show him what it looks like when people choose cruelty over compassion. And then I'll show him this letter. Not to teach him about forgiveness, but to show him that people are complicated. That even those who hurt us might eventually understand what they've done. That remorse can come too late to fix anything but still matters somehow. Dylan reached out 6 months after his mother's death. He wanted to talk, he said, to explain things, to maybe find closure. I agreed to meet him at the same coffee shop where his father had given me the letter. Dylan looked wrecked. His marriage to Bethany was falling apart, he told me. She'd filed for separation and was fighting for full custody of their daughter. His mother's death had broken something in him, made him realize how much of his life had been controlled by her. He'd been in therapy for months, working through decades of enmeshment and manipulation. I listened without commenting. Finally, he said what he'd come to say. I'm sorry. For all of it. For leaving you in that hospital. For letting my mother treat you that way. For not defending you when you needed me most. I looked at him, this broken man who'd once been my husband, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just emptiness. Your apology doesn't change what happened, I said. It doesn't give me back the baby we lost or the marriage we could have had. It doesn't undo the months of gaslighting or the trauma of being abandoned when I needed you most. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know, but I needed you to hear it anyway. I stood to leave. Before I walked out, I turned back. I hope you treat your daughter better than your mother treated me. I hope you break the pattern. Then I left and never looked back. That was 2 years ago. I haven't heard from Dylan since. His cousin occasionally sends updates. Bethany got full custody. Dylan has supervised visitation every other weekend. He's apparently still in therapy, trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughter, trying to become the kind of father who shows up. I'm happy for his daughter if that's true. No child should have to grow up with a parent who's emotionally absent. My own son is 7 now. Terrence's daughter is in college studying social work. We had another baby, a daughter, who just turned 3. My life is full and complicated and sometimes exhausting, but it's mine. Built on truth, not lies. On support, not abandonment. On people who show up when it matters. Sometimes I think about that girl in the hospital room, bleeding and alone, convinced she was losing her mind. I want to go back and tell her she's not crazy, that the proof will come, that she'll survive this and build something beautiful on the other side. But mostly I think about the baby I lost, the one who never got to exist outside of those 12 weeks. I think about who they might have been, what they might have looked like, and I let myself grieve for them properly, without shame or accusation. That baby deserved better too. Deserved a family that would have honored their brief existence instead of weaponizing it. I named them in private, a name nobody else knows. Some things are too sacred to share. Recently, my son asked about my first marriage. He'd overheard me talking to Renee about the divorce. I gave him an age-appropriate version, that I'd been married before his dad, that it didn't work out, that sometimes people aren't kind to each other even when they should be. He thought about it for a minute, then asked the question that broke my heart. Did he love you? I considered lying, but I'd built my second life on truth, and I owed my son the same. I don't think he knew how, I said honestly. His family taught him that love looks like control and obligation. They didn't teach him about showing up or being present. My son nodded seriously. I'm glad you married Dad instead. Me too, I said. Me too. That's where the story could end. Not with dramatic revenge or perfect closure, but with a quiet life built on harder truths, with a child who'll grow up knowing that love means showing up, with a husband who proves it every day, with a woman who refused to let cruelty rewrite her reality. The hospital footage is still on that USB drive, stored in a safety deposit box. Sometimes I think about watching it again, reminding myself it was real, but I don't need to anymore. I carry the truth in my body, in my healed heart, in the family I've built. But life kept happening. 3 years after Dylan's mother died, I got another call from his cousin. This time she was calling about Dylan's father. He'd had a stroke. A major one. He was in the ICU and the prognosis wasn't good. The family was gathering at the hospital. She thought I should know, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because she knew what that hospital had meant to me. Maybe because she thought I'd want to see the irony. I didn't go to the hospital. I sent flowers with a generic card. I'm not cruel, just careful. Dylan's father died 3 days later. I didn't go to that funeral either, but I did something I hadn't expected. I wrote a letter to Dylan, not to forgive him or offer comfort, but to say something I needed him to understand. I wrote about how his parents had shaped him into someone incapable of real intimacy, how they taught him that love was performance, not presence, how their own fears and rigidity had cost him his first marriage and were now costing him his second. I wrote that I hoped losing both parents would give him space to figure out who he actually was, that maybe without their voices in his head, he could learn to show up for his daughter. I ended by saying I didn't forgive him, but I understood him better now. Understanding wasn't absolution, but it was something. I mailed the letter and immediately regretted it. What if he took it as an invitation to reconnect? What if he showed up at my house or tried to call? But he didn't. 2 weeks later, I got a letter back. Just 1 page, handwritten. He thanked me for writing, said he'd read it a dozen times, that he was trying, really trying, to be different, that his daughter was in therapy because of how badly he'd messed up her early years, that Bethany had gotten remarried, and her new husband was a better father figure than Dylan had ever been. That hurt him, he wrote, but he was trying to be grateful rather than resentful. He ended by saying he hoped I was happy, that I deserved happiness more than anyone he'd ever known. I put the letter in the same box as his mother's. Evidence that people could change, even if the change came too late to matter. My daughter started preschool that year. She was bright and curious and completely fearless. the opposite of how I'd been at her age. Terrence joked that she'd gotten all my stubbornness with none of my anxiety. He was probably right. One day she came home from school asking about siblings. A girl in her class had a baby brother and wanted to know if she'd get one too. Terrence and I exchanged looks. We'd talked about having more kids, but kept putting it off. Life was busy enough with two. But something about her question made me reconsider. I was 38 now. If we wanted another baby, we couldn't wait much longer. That night, after the kids were in bed, Terrence and I talked seriously about it. He was willing if I was. But he wanted to make sure I was ready emotionally, not just logistically. The last pregnancy had been healing, but also terrifying. Could I do it again? I thought about it for weeks. Talked to my therapist, talked to my sister, talked to Renee. Finally, I decided yes, I could do it again. Because I wasn't the same person who'd lost that first baby. I wasn't alone anymore. I had proof that good families existed. We got pregnant 4 months later. This pregnancy was harder than the last. I was older, more tired. The morning sickness lasted until week 20. My body ached in ways it hadn't before. But Terrence was there every step. And this time I had 2 kids watching me with excitement and concern. My son would put his hand on my belly and talk to the baby. My daughter would bring me crackers when I looked queasy. They were learning what care looked like in real time. At 32 weeks, I started having contractions. False labor, the doctor said. But I needed bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. Terrence took family leave. My sister came to stay with us. Renee organized a meal train. I spent 6 weeks on the couch, watching my family take care of me. It was strange and uncomfortable and beautiful. I'd spent so much of my life being the one who handled everything. Learning to receive care was its own kind of healing. Our second son was born at 38 weeks, healthy and loud. The delivery was easier than the first. Maybe because I knew what to expect. Maybe because I wasn't carrying the trauma of that first loss into the delivery room. Terrence cut the umbilical cord while our older kids watched through FaceTime. My daughter cried with joy. My son wanted to know when the baby could play catch. Typical. We named him after Terrence's father, who died before we met. But I gave him a middle name I'd been holding on to for years. The name I'd privately given to the baby I'd lost. When I told Terrence the significance, he held me while I cried. Happy tears this time. The baby who'd never been born had a place in our family's story. Not erased, not forgotten, just part of the complicated path that had led us here. 3 months after our second son was born, I got a message from an unknown number. It was Bethany. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. She wrote that she'd found my message from years ago, the one telling her to ask about the visitor logs. She'd finally asked. Dylan had told her everything. About the miscarriage, the hospital, his mother's manipulation, about how they'd gaslit me for weeks and I'd had proof all along, about how she was now experiencing the same patterns of control and abandonment. She wrote that she wished she'd listened to me sooner, that she'd wasted 3 years trying to fix something that was never going to work, that she was grateful to be out, to have full custody, to have found someone who actually showed up. She ended by saying thank you, for trying to warn her, even when she wouldn't listen, for showing her that demanding better wasn't vindictive, it was survival. I wrote back, just one line, I'm glad you got out. We never spoke again, but I thought about her sometimes. Another woman who'd learned the hard way what Dylan's family was capable of. Another survivor. My older son started 2nd grade. Terrence's daughter graduated college and got a job as a social worker specializing in family trauma. She was brilliant at it. She'd lived through loss early, and it made her compassionate in ways that couldn't be taught. One evening, she came over for dinner and mentioned she'd encountered a case that reminded her of my story. A young mother who'd lost a baby, and whose in-laws were accusing her of exaggerating her grief for attention. The woman was falling apart, convinced she was crazy. Terrence's daughter had given her information about medical records and security footage, had helped her understand that what she was experiencing was abuse, not support. I felt something shift in my chest. That was my story being used to help someone else. That was my worst experience becoming someone else's roadmap out. I asked if there was a way to connect with the woman anonymously, to share my experience in more detail. Terrence's daughter set it up through her agency. I wrote everything out. The timeline, the evidence, the divorce. What had worked, what hadn't. How to protect yourself when your own family becomes the threat. The woman wrote back 3 weeks later. She'd gotten the footage, had filed for divorce, was staying with her sister while the proceedings went through. She thanked me for showing her she wasn't alone, that you could survive this and build something better on the other side. After that, Terrence's daughter started referring more women to me, always anonymously, always through the agency. Women who'd experienced medical trauma and then emotional abuse from the people who should have supported them. I'd write to them, share my story, answer questions. It became a kind of ministry, turning my worst experience into a lifeline for others. Some of the women just needed to know they weren't crazy. Others needed practical advice about gathering evidence and protecting themselves legally. A few were so deep in the gaslighting they couldn't see a way out. I'd send them the basics. Document everything. Trust your experience. Get proof before you confront anyone. Not all of them made it out. Some went back to their partners, convinced they could fix things. Some disappeared after a few messages, and I'd wonder what happened to them. But enough did escape. Enough found safety and started rebuilding. That had to count for something. My younger son turned 2. My daughter was in 1st grade. My older son was in 4th. Terrence was talking about semi-retirement in a few years. We'd built this full, chaotic, beautiful life. and I'd built it on the ruins of something that had nearly destroyed me. One Saturday morning, I was at the farmer's market with my daughter when someone called my name. I turned and saw Dylan. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, less haggard. His daughter was with him, now about 7 years old. We stood there awkwardly, my daughter holding my hand, his daughter clutching his. Finally, he spoke. "I've been wanting to run into you," he said. "I wanted you to see that I'm trying, that I'm doing better." I looked at his daughter. She seemed happy enough. "That's good," I said neutrally. "I mean it. My therapist helped me understand what Mom did to me," he continued. "How she trained me to avoid conflict and emotion. How that made me abandon you when you needed me most." My daughter tugged my hand, bored with the adult conversation. "I need to go," I said. But Dylan kept talking. "I want you to know I tell my daughter about you, about how you showed me what strength looks like, how you didn't let us destroy you." I felt my throat tighten. "That's not my story to tell her," I said. "That's between you and her." He nodded, understanding. Before we walked away, his daughter spoke up. "Are you the lady from Daddy's hospital story?" I froze. "What hospital story?" I asked. "Daddy says you were very sick once and nobody helped you, but you saved yourself." His daughter looked at me with curious eyes. "That was really brave." I glanced at Dylan. He looked ashamed and proud at the same time. "I wanted her to know what real strength is," he said quietly. "Not just in stories, in real life." I nodded, unable to speak. Then I took my daughter's hand and walked away. As we drove home, my daughter asked who that man was. "An old friend," I said. "Someone I used to know a long time ago." She accepted this easily, the way kids do. But I thought about that interaction for days. Dylan was telling his daughter about me, using my story, my trauma, as a teaching tool. Part of me was furious. How dare he use what he'd done to me as some kind of lesson? But another part understood. He was trying to show his daughter what he'd learned too late, that abandoning people had consequences. That strength meant standing up to your family when they were wrong. That cruelty wasn't love, no matter how it was packaged. Maybe it was the best he could do. Maybe it was enough. That night, I told Terrence about the encounter. He listened carefully, then asked how I felt about it. I didn't know. Angry, confused, oddly moved. "It's complicated," I finally said. He smiled. "Most real things are." We were lying in bed, the house quiet for once. Both our sons were asleep. Our daughter was in her room reading by flashlight even though she wasn't supposed to. I could hear Terrence's daughter watching TV downstairs. This was my family now. Built from broken pieces and hard choices. Built from deciding I deserved better and refusing to settle for less. The hospital footage was still in that safety deposit box. I visited it once a year on the anniversary of the miscarriage. Not to torture myself, but to remember. To stay connected to that younger version of me who'd survived something impossible. Who'd found proof when everyone said she was lying. Who'd walked away when staying would have killed something essential in her soul. Sometimes I brought flowers. Sometimes I just sat in the parking lot outside the bank, remembering and releasing. My therapist asked once if I'd ever forgive Dylan and his family. I thought about it carefully before answering. "Forgiveness isn't really the point," I said. "Understanding is. I understand why they did what they did. I understand the pattern of protection and denial that made them capable of cruelty. But understanding doesn't erase harm. It just helps me make sense of it." She nodded, satisfied with that answer. Some things don't need forgiveness. They just need to be survived. I kept writing to the women Terrence's daughter referred to me. Each story was different, but the patterns were the same. Medical trauma, then emotional abandonment. Gaslighting from the people who should provide comfort. The slow realization that you're not crazy, just surrounded by people who need you to be. I'd tell them about documentation, about trusting themselves, about finding people who would believe them. Some wrote back with updates. They'd left, they'd gotten custody, they'd started therapy. Others I never heard from again. My older son turned 10. Double digits, he announced proudly. He was playing soccer and learning piano and reading above his grade level. He was also starting to ask harder questions about family, about relationships, about my past. I answered honestly but carefully. He was old enough to handle some truth, but not all of it. Not yet. One day he asked why my parents weren't around much. My mom and dad lived across the country and we saw them twice a year. They called every week but weren't very involved. The truth was complicated. After my divorce from Dylan, my parents had suggested maybe I'd been too harsh, that marriages required compromise, that Dylan's mother had just been looking out for her son. I'd stopped talking to them for 6 months after that. When we reconnected, I'd set strict boundaries. We could have a relationship, but they would never question my decision to leave. They would never defend Dylan or his family, and they would never suggest I'd overreacted. They'd mostly kept to those boundaries, though the relationship was strained. I told my son a simpler version. "Sometimes adults disagree about important things," I said. "Grandma and Grandpa didn't understand something that happened to me a long time ago. We still love each other, but we're not as close as we used to be." He thought about this seriously. "Did they hurt your feelings?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "They did." He nodded. "I'm sorry, Mommy." Then he went back to his homework, satisfied with the explanation. Terrence squeezed my shoulder as he passed through the kitchen. "You handled that well," he said. I wasn't sure I had, but I appreciated the support. My daughter started having nightmares. She'd wake up crying about monsters under her bed, shadows in her closet. Normal kid fears, probably. But they triggered something in me. I thought about that hospital room at 2 a.m. when I'd been alone and terrified. I thought about how no one had come. I started sleeping on the floor of her room until the nightmares passed. Terrence offered to take shifts, but I needed to do this myself. Needed to prove I could show up for someone small and scared, that I could be the person who stayed. After 2 weeks, the nightmares faded. My daughter slept peacefully again. But I kept thinking about those midnight hours on her floor. About how parenting meant being present even when it was uncomfortable. Even when you were tired or frustrated or scared yourself. Dylan had never learned that lesson. His mother hadn't taught it. So when I'd needed him, he defaulted to avoidance. It wasn't an excuse, just an explanation. Understanding the pattern didn't erase the harm, but it helped me make peace with it. Renee got engaged. To a woman she'd been dating for a year, a professor at the local university. They were deliriously happy. The kind of couple that finished each other's sentences and held hands at the grocery store. At her engagement party, she pulled me aside. "I wouldn't have this if I hadn't watched you choose yourself," she said. "You showed me what not settling looks like." I hugged her, crying a little. We'd been through so much together. She'd seen me at my absolute worst and never wavered. The wedding was beautiful. My kids were junior attendants. Terrence gave a speech about love as a choice, not just a feeling. About showing up day after day, especially when it was hard. He looked at me during the speech and I knew he was thinking about that hospital room. About how he'd promised to never leave me alone like that. About how he'd kept that promise every single day since. Renee and her wife moved to a bigger apartment after the wedding. They were talking about adopting. Watching them build their life reminded me how far I'd come, how much I'd rebuilt. My younger son started talking in full sentences. He was funny and stubborn and completely fearless. He'd climb anything, touch everything, ask constant questions. Terrence joked that he was making up for my anxiety by having none of his own. One afternoon, I was pushing him on the swing when a woman approached me hesitantly. "Are you the one who writes the letters?" she asked. "Through family support services?" I tensed, uncertain how she'd found me. Terrence's daughter had promised anonymity, but the woman looked desperate, not threatening. "Please," she said. "I need to talk to someone who understands." We sat on a bench while her kids played nearby. She told me her story. A stillbirth at 36 weeks. Her husband's family accusing her of not trying hard enough to save the baby, of ignoring warning signs, of being dramatic about her grief. The husband himself had checked out emotionally, unable to handle her crying. She'd found my letter through the agency, and it was the first time she'd felt seen. But she needed more. She needed to know the specifics of how I'd gathered evidence, how I'd protected myself legally, how I'd found the strength to leave. I told her everything. The hospital footage, the visitor logs, the email that proved they'd known, the divorce, the settlement, the years of rebuilding. She took notes on her phone, her hands shaking. When I finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered. "Everyone keeps telling me to move on, that I'm dwelling, but I can't move on when they're actively making it worse." "I know," I said. "I know exactly what you mean." We exchanged contact information. I told her to reach out anytime, that she didn't have to go through this alone. Over the next 6 months, I helped her navigate her divorce. Helped her find a lawyer who understood domestic abuse. Helped her document every interaction, every accusation. She got full custody of her surviving children, got a settlement that allowed her to start over. Last I heard, she'd moved to another state and started a support group for women who'd lost babies and then lost their marriages. My story had become her roadmap. Her story was becoming a roadmap for others. The ripple effect of surviving. Dylan's cousin stopped calling with updates. I think she finally realized I'd moved on, that his life wasn't relevant to mine anymore. But occasionally I'd hear something through mutual acquaintances. Dylan was still in therapy, still had supervised visits with his daughter. Bethany's new husband had formally adopted the girl. Dylan had signed the papers without fighting. Maybe he'd finally understood that being a father meant more than biology, that showing up consistently mattered more than anything else. I thought about reaching out to tell him I was proud of him for that decision, but I didn't. Some chapters need to stay closed. Our older son started middle school. The anxiety I'd expected him to inherit from me finally showed up. He worried about grades, about fitting in, about disappointing us. We got him into therapy immediately, taught him coping strategies, made sure he knew that our love wasn't conditional on his performance. That being anxious didn't make him broken, just human. Watching him learn to manage his anxiety was healing for me too. I'd spent so much of my life being told my feelings were wrong, my reactions exaggerated. With him, we normalized emotion instead of pathologizing it. We validated his fears while teaching him tools to face them. This was breaking a pattern, not from Dylan's family, but from my own childhood. From parents who'd valued appearance over authenticity, who'd taught me to perform rather than feel. My son would grow up knowing his emotions were valid, that they didn't need to be managed or hidden, just felt and processed. Terrence's daughter got married to another social worker she'd met at a conference. They were planning to foster teens who'd aged out of the system, kids who needed stability and support but had been let down by every adult in their lives. At her wedding, she gave a speech thanking Terrence for showing her what good parenting looked like after her mother died. She thanked me for showing her that survival was possible even when you were surrounded by cruelty, that speaking truth to power wasn't optional, it was essential. I cried through the entire speech. My daughter turned 8. She wanted a big party, so we rented out a skating rink and invited her entire class. Watching her zoom around with her friends, completely confident and joyful, felt like a victory. She'd never known a family that didn't show up. Never experienced the kind of abandonment that had nearly destroyed me. She took love and presence for granted because she'd never known anything else. That was exactly how it should be. Our younger son started preschool. He cried on the first day, clinging to my leg. But by the second week, he was running into the classroom without looking back. His teacher said he was empathetic beyond his years, that he noticed when other kids were sad and would bring them toys or pat their hands. I wondered if he'd absorbed something from our family culture, from watching us show up for each other consistently. 15 years after my divorce, I got one final message from Dylan. It was long and rambling and clearly written late at night. He told me his daughter was 13 now, that she'd been asking hard questions about her childhood, about why her parents divorced, about what had happened to break apart her family. He'd told her some of it. About the miscarriage, about how badly he'd handled it, about how his mother had controlled him in ways he was only now understanding. His daughter had asked to meet me, to hear my version of the story. Dylan wanted to know if I'd be willing, if enough time had passed that we could have that conversation without it destroying either of us. I sat with that message for a week before responding. Part of me wanted to refuse. That chapter was closed, and his daughter deserved to figure out her own relationship with him without my interference. But another part remembered being a kid and knowing something was wrong but not having the full picture. Never getting answers because adults decided what you were old enough to know. I wrote back. I'd meet with her, but only if she initiated it. If she wanted to reach out to me directly, I'd respond honestly. But I wouldn't insert myself into their relationship uninvited. Dylan agreed. 2 months later, I got an email from his daughter. Her name was Violet. She wrote carefully, clearly nervous. She'd heard her father's version of what happened. She'd heard bits and pieces from family, but she wanted to hear from me, wanted to understand why I'd left, what her grandmother had done, what it all meant. I wrote back asking what specifically she wanted to know. She replied with a list of questions. Had her father really abandoned me at the hospital? Had her grandmother really accused me of faking a miscarriage? Had I really had video proof? And most importantly, did I think her father had changed? Could people really get better, or was he just performing? I answered every question honestly. Yes, he'd abandoned me. Yes, his mother had orchestrated a campaign of gaslighting. Yes, I'd had proof and they'd still denied it. And as for whether he'd changed, I told her I couldn't answer that. I'd seen evidence that he was trying, but only she could determine if his actions matched his words. Only she could decide if the father he was now made up for the father he'd been. We exchanged emails for months. She'd ask questions and I'd answer them. Sometimes she'd share stories about her childhood, about feeling like her father was there but not really present, about her grandmother's control and criticism, about watching her mother struggle in the marriage before finally leaving. It was like reading my own story from a different angle. Violet was smart and perceptive and carrying wounds she didn't fully understand yet, but she was asking the right questions. That was a start. Eventually, she asked if we could meet in person. I agreed, with conditions. We'd meet in a public place. Dylan wouldn't be there. And if at any point she felt uncomfortable, we could stop. We met at a coffee shop downtown. She was tall for 13, with Dylan's eyes and Bethany's determination. We talked for 2 hours. I showed her some of the documentation, not all of it. She didn't need to see the hospital footage, but I showed her the visitor logs. Let her see with her own eyes what had happened. She cried when she saw the timestamps. Her father had been there 8 minutes and left, her grandmother 9 minutes. They'd known and chosen to leave me alone. I'm so sorry, she said through tears. I didn't know it was that bad. I reached across the table and took her hand. You don't have to apologize for them, I said. You weren't even born yet. None of this is your fault. She looked at me with red eyes. But I feel like I need to apologize anyway. For existing. For being the reason he moved on so fast. For replacing you. I squeezed her hand tighter. You didn't replace me. You're your own person. And I'm glad you exist. You deserve a better father than the one you got, but that's on him to fix. Not on you to feel guilty about. We left the coffee shop and walked through the park nearby. She asked about my life now. About my kids. My marriage. My work. I told her the edited version. That I'd rebuilt and found happiness. That trauma didn't have to be permanent. That you could survive impossible things and still build a beautiful life on the other side. When we parted ways, she hugged me tight. Thank you, she whispered, for not pretending it was okay. For not letting him rewrite what happened. Adults always try to protect us from the truth, but sometimes the truth is the only thing that helps. I watched her walk away. This kid who'd been caught in the wreckage of my first marriage, who'd spent her whole life dealing with her father's inability to show up. I hoped she'd be okay, that she'd find her own path through the damage. That night, I told Terrence about the meeting. He listened carefully, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you think she'll be okay? I didn't know. Maybe. If she kept asking questions. If she kept demanding honesty. If she learned young that other people's dysfunction didn't have to become hers. But I couldn't save her. I could only show her that survival was possible. The rest was up to her. Our older son graduated 8th grade. He'd made it through middle school with his anxiety mostly managed. He had friends, decent grades, a sense of who he was becoming. At his graduation ceremony, he gave a speech about resilience. About how facing hard things made you stronger. About how being vulnerable wasn't weakness. I cried the entire time. After the ceremony, he came over and hugged me. Thanks for not giving up on me, he said. Even when I was really anxious and annoying. You were never annoying, I told him. You were learning. There's a difference. He smiled, then ran off to take pictures with his friends. Terrence wrapped his arm around me. You did that, he said quietly. You taught him it was safe to feel things. I leaned into him, watching our son laugh with his classmates. This was the legacy of survival. Not just escaping abuse, but building something so fundamentally different that your kids couldn't even imagine the alternative. My daughter started middle school the next year. She was confident in ways I'd never been, unafraid to speak up when something was wrong, quick to defend kids who were being bullied. She got detention once for telling a teacher he was being unfair to a student. I should have been mad, but I was proud. She'd learned to use her voice, to stand up even when it was uncomfortable. That was worth detention. Our younger son was in kindergarten now, reading early, making friends easily, completely secure in his place in the world. He'd never known instability or abandonment. His biggest trauma so far was when we'd forgotten to pack his favorite snack one day. That was exactly how childhood should be. 20 years after my divorce, I got a final message from Dylan's cousin. She was writing to tell me Dylan had died. Heart attack, like his mother. He was 52. The funeral was small, just immediate family. Violet had been the one to find him. She'd gone to his apartment for their bi-weekly dinner and found him unresponsive on the floor. The cousin thought I should know, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because I'd been such a significant part of his story. Maybe because closure required knowing how stories ended. I thanked her for telling me and asked how Violet was doing. Not well, the cousin said. She's blaming herself for not visiting sooner, for not noticing warning signs, for all the typical guilt that comes with sudden death. I reached out to Violet immediately, sent her a long message about grief and guilt and how none of this was her fault, about how you can do everything right and people still die, about how love doesn't prevent loss, just makes it more painful. She wrote back days later. I keep thinking about that hospital footage you showed me, she said, about how he left you alone, about how he was capable of that kind of abandonment, but he was also capable of showing up for dinner every other week, of trying in therapy, of telling me he was proud of me. How do I hold both versions of him? You don't have to choose, I wrote back. People are complicated. He hurt me badly, and he tried to do better with you. Both things can be true. You're allowed to grieve him and be angry at him and forgive him, and never forgive him all at once. There's no right way to feel about complicated people. She wrote back one more time. Thank you for letting me know him as more than a villain, and for letting me know you as more than a victim, for showing me that survival isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming honest. I never responded to that message. There was nothing else to say. The story was complete. My older son went to college, studying psychology, hoping to become a therapist. He wanted to help people process trauma, help them make sense of impossible situations. Terrence joked that he'd been training for it his whole life, watching me work through my past. Maybe he was right. Our daughter was starting high school, already planning to study law. She wanted to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Our younger son was in middle school, still figuring out who he was. Terrence and I were in our 50s now, graying, slower, but content. We'd built this life from rubble, and it had held. Last month, I finally threw away the hospital footage. Went to the safety deposit box on the anniversary of the miscarriage like I'd done for 25 years. But this time, I took the USB drive home. I asked my kids if they wanted to see it, to understand this formative piece of their mother's history. They all said yes. We sat together in the living room and I played them the clips. The ER entrance, the ultrasound room, the hospital room at 2 a.m. They watched in silence. When it ended, my older son spoke first. I can't believe they did that to you, he said. How did you survive? I thought about that question. How had I survived? I stopped believing them. I said finally. They told me I was crazy and dramatic and lying, but I knew what I'd experienced. I knew my own truth. And once I had proof, I didn't let them gaslight me anymore. That's all survival is sometimes. Refusing to accept someone else's version of your reality. My daughter asked if I'd ever forgiven them. No, I said honestly, but I understand them better. And understanding helped me let go of some of the anger. Not all of it. Some anger is righteous and earned, but enough that I could build a life that wasn't defined by what they did. Our younger son, always the most direct, asked if I still thought about the baby. Every day, I said. Not with sadness anymore. But I think about who they might have been, what our family would look like if they'd lived. And I've made peace with never knowing. We threw away the USB drive together, drove to the beach and tossed it into the ocean. It felt ceremonial, final. That chapter was truly over now. Not forgotten, but released. Terrence held my hand on the drive home. You okay? He asked. I am, I said. And I meant it. The story had started with cruelty and abandonment, with being gaslit and betrayed by people who should have protected me. But it ended with this. A family that showed up. Kids who knew their worth. A partner who proved every day that love meant presence, not performance. A life built on truth instead of lies. The hospital footage was gone, but the truth remained. I'd survived. I'd demanded better. I'd built something beautiful from the wreckage. That was enough. That was everything.